Thank you, Emma. And hello to everybody. Now this is going to be difficult because the projector is sort of at groin height here. I will stand over here so that you can see me and not just my illuminated groin. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the experiences that I've had being involved with this emerging debate about upstream public engagement and the broader debate about the governance of emerging technologies. As Emma described, I've been doing this both as an academic and as a policymaker on the fringes of the establishment and at the heart of the establishment within the Royal Society down in London. And I have been involved in various sort of efforts to directly engage members of the public in these questions of emerging technologies, and also engaged in the policy discussions about what we do with that information that we glean from members of the public. First of all, anybody recognise this picture? Can you tell me where it comes from, except John, who I've already discussed this with?
Dr. Seuss, the Lorax.
Dr. Seuss, the Lorax is exactly right. So the story of the Lorax is a story of the governance of innovation, or the failure of the governance of innovation. We have an innovator, the Onceler, we only ever see his arm, we never see his face, who discovers a new way of turning these truffular trees into what he calls thneeds, which are sort of generic, pointless devices that nobody wants but everyone needs. They're an iPad, basically. And he discovers more and more ridiculous ways to do this increasingly efficiently. By the end of the story, uses up all of the truffular trees in the environment, destroys the ecosystem, destroys his own raw material, and in effect, innovation eats itself. And the message, and this was bound up in the sort of post-Silent Spring birth of environmentalism within the States, but the message is a familiar one, is that innovation left to its own devices won't be able to predict or mitigate its own negative impacts, and there is therefore a role for governance in getting involved in some way. And governance in this book takes the form of the Lorax, this guy here with his moustache, who speaks for the trees. But he speaks rather fatalistically for the trees. And he takes a familiar position that either innovation can be sped up or it can be slowed down. We can either enhance it or we can regulate it and stop it. And the Lorax is firmly anti-innovation. So the question is, can we govern innovation in emerging technologies in a more constructive way and recognise that rather than just speeding up or slowing down innovation, there might be trajectories, directions that are better and directions that are worse. And this is an issue that has been identified. This is still a fantastically useful book written in 1980. And it talks about what Collingridge calls the control dilemma of technology, which is that we have to govern emerging technologies to get good outcomes, but we must do so in a condition of ignorance, because we can't predict the future impacts of these technologies. And by the time that we come to know about the future impacts of these technologies, it's too late to be able to do anything about them. And this was obviously before GM crops, nanotechnology, synthetic biology, and all of those sorts of things that people like me rattle off. Just to give you a bit of policy context then for the UK, in terms of how the UK is currently approaching this question of the governance of emerging technologies, we need to go back a little bit to consider the sort of brief history of agonising over the relationship between science and society, and the move that I'm sure some of you will be familiar with in this room, the move from a model of that relationship in terms of a deficit. The public are deficient in understanding, and that is the root cause of their lack of agreement with experts in terms of matters of science and technology. And the prescription that came from this, that every scientist must get out there and better explain what they're doing and educate, with the assumption being that to know science was to love science, in effect. If only members of the public knew all the things that we knew, then they would love science as much as we do. The recognition in the 1990s in the UK was that that model was poorly founded and didn't work in practice. And so we saw a move to a model of dialogue, that a sort of acceptance that members of the public had legitimate questions that they might ask of scientists and that they might ask of processes of innovation that need to be listened to. And the landmark report there is a report that came out from the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee in 2000. So we've now had about a decade of coming to terms with this sense that public dialogue is the way that we do things in the UK, apparently. And the more recent move, and one that we discussed at Demos, was the move upstream. It's that rather than having dialogue at a time when technologies were already clear and well established, when their impacts were known, what you actually needed to do was have that debate earlier, at a time when choices can still be affected. Because there the lesson was from GM crops, where there was a rejection of GM crops by consumers, supermarkets, civil society in the UK, and a dialogue exercise, a massive amount of money was spent on a dialogue exercise to try to understand the public's hopes and fears, but it was seen as too late to actually do anything about it. And so what was the point in doing it when it didn't have any purchase on decision making? And this idea of upstream public engagement became accepted within the official policy discourse. So this was a report that came out from the Royal Society and Royal Academy of Engineering talking about nanotechnology, saying that nanotechnology, when was this, 7 years ago, there was an opportunity to have this constructive debate early on. And nanotechnology, if you like, became the test case for this new mode of engagement between science and society. And just to take you back, sort of nanotechnology, like a lot of emerging technology areas, is characterized by, on the one hand, grand visions of hope, and on the other, equally grand apocalyptic visions of doom, in this case represented by a lovely protest group who call themselves Thong and employ a rather clever reference, plenty of room at this bottom, which is the reference, a reference to Richard Feynman's original article, Plenty of Room at the Bottom, where he describes the need for nanotechnology as a new research domain. But the interesting thing for our purposes is that they're not protesting about something, they're protesting about things that have yet to come. So this is a sort of backlash before they've got anything to backlash against. And so this debate started happening. You got people like Prince Charles getting involved in nanotech and saying, will it just be the next GM? Will we see the same pattern repeating itself in all sorts of different ways? And Jamie will talk a bit more about this. At the time, we at Demos did a large public engagement project with a number of organisations, who you can see on the right-hand side there, and the idea was that by doing bits of public engagement, so this was using a sort of citizens' jury set of models, and I can talk more if people are interested about any of these various components, but we would look at nanotechnology as it was playing out within these different domains, within science funders, within regulators, within the developing world, within companies. And the idea would be that we would learn a bit more about how to do public engagement and learn a bit more about whether public engagement was useful within these particular contexts. Now, we weren't always interested, as was many of the academics who came at this, in the question of, well, what do we do with this? It wasn't just democratising a part of innovation just for the hell of it. It was almost always that public engagement was a means to a particular end, that particular end being better governance in some way. And so the question was, how could the sorts of public engagement exercise that we were conducting connect to policy making? And the connection to policy is a fraught and difficult one, because policymakers have a very particular view of how they think policy happens, and this comes from a set of long-held assumptions about the public interest. It comes from the desire for an easy life. It comes from the need for civil servants to balance the whims of ministers with what they claim is evidence-based policy. And they would like public engagement to just help them inform that process. And this was the sort of the mode of engagement that they had with us as people doing the public engagement. So they would come to us and they would say, we don't know about the public context of nanotechnology. We don't know what people think. We need you to give us answers. And we would say, the problem is that public engagement doesn't really give you very good answers. If you're doing a citizen's jury, what does it matter really what those 12 people think in terms of whether that represents public opinion? But what it does give you is a new set of questions. And it's a new set of questions that, I mean, this is just one pretty random snapshot of questions that were asked during one public engagement exercise that we did on nanoparticles and land remediation, to give you a sense. And they range from the sort of technical to the highly political. And they present quite a substantial challenge to policymakers, because policymakers will only be able to engage in a fraction of these conversations. And we've seen similarly within synthetic biology, the large synthetic biology dialogue exercise that took place, when was it, last year? Came up with 5 headline questions. And for anybody involved in the governance of science and innovation, those questions are very disruptive. They don't fit into normal modes of policy making. They're quite hard to answer, and they actually demand a new sort of conversation. On the other side, on the public side as well, we're seeing emerging evidence that this sort of simplistic model in which you're trying to democratise science and innovation by just getting members of the public to get involved and make decisions has a rather misguided view about what people actually want. The survey research that came out a few months ago in the UK suggests that people aren't actually as interested in directly getting engaged with science and innovation. The majority of people think that science and innovation need to be opened up in some way. They need to be democratised, but that they themselves aren't the people to do it. So what in effect this is a call for, and this is more of the stats here, this is a call for better governance. It's not saying get people like me involved. It's saying that I need as a citizen to be able to trust that governance processes involved around science and innovation are take account of unconventional views. So here you have a majority of people who would say, I would like to know that the public are consulted on science issues, but I don't want to be involved personally. So what do we do with all of that? Well, the move that I've been involved with more recently is to play down the public engagement end of things and play up the governance end of things through, if nothing else, the adoption of this phrase, responsible innovation, which is starting to get taken seriously by research councils and by the European Commission. And there, because as is the way that as these debates move on, it tends to be that the emerging technologies that are particularly interesting or problematic move as well. The new discussion is taking place around this area of geoengineering. Now, does anybody in here have no idea what geoengineering is? Be honest. Okay, so good. Enough people don't know what geoengineering is to warrant my quick description of it. So geoengineering is the attempt to, at a planetary scale, intervene with the Earth's climate to, well, the obvious reason is to mitigate global warming. The way that the story is playing out is that given that our attempts to control the Earth's climate using mitigation of emissions aren't going so well, it makes sense to have a plan B. And in effect, you will be able to control the climate yourself by either sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere or by controlling the amount of sunlight that gets to the Earth. And so you'll start to, you hear talk about various methods that you might use to do this, ranging from fairly sort of conventional things like growing trees, and avoiding deforestation to act as a carbon sink, to the more ridiculous, like launching a mirror into space between the Earth and the Sun that would actually reduce the amount of sunlight getting to the Earth. Okay, this is geoengineering, and I would hope that with this audience I wouldn't need to tell you that it raises some rather troublesome concerns, because as soon as scientists and innovators say we are interested in and able to do some of these things, well, they themselves and any one of us would say, well, have you thought hard enough about how predictable the consequences of what you're doing are? Have you thought about how the distribution of benefits and risks would fall onto the earth? You know, do we really believe that people in sub-Saharan Africa will benefit as much from these sorts of interventions as people in the States will be, given the resilience of their lives and all the rest of it? And at the very top political level, as soon as we start getting interested in geoengineering, the suspicion is that we will be less interested in attempts to mitigate climate change. So we're starting to see NGOs mobilise against geoengineering. This is a campaign called Hands Off Mother Earth, run by the same sort of group who were previously semi-naked at a nanotechnology conference. And what they're saying is there should be a moratorium on all geoengineering research. So the question is, how do you steer a sustainable path through this particular controversy? And this is an area where, you know, actually you could argue that no geoengineering research has actually taken place yet, or no research that calls itself geoengineering and has the ability to intervene in the environment has taken place yet. So we're at a very early stage here. So one of the things that I've been involved in is working with one of the projects, one of the first UK geoengineering projects. And all these guys are trying to do, it's quite a modest thing, is they're launching a balloon up into the sky and with a big hose attached, and they just want to squirt water out of that balloon because they want to see whether the hose works, whether the water disperses in the right way, and they just want to, you know, see what works. But because this is the first trial of a technology that might lead to a possible geoengineering technique, it's problematic because it is part of a pathway that to many people is seen as the wrong way to go. And so working with and this is funded by the EPSRC, who are the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and as a response to their previous engagement with the synthetic biology dialogue, they are one of these organisations that has tried to grapple with these very difficult questions for policymakers and say, okay, this isn't just business as usual. Dealing with new technologies requires a fundamentally different approach. And so what we've started to do is build a model of responsible innovation that encompasses not just governing the products of science and innovation, nor does it just encompass governing the processes of science and innovation. You know, is something being done in an open and sustainable way? But it also looks at the purposes of science and innovation, which is a much more complicated conversation for a scientist to have. So a couple of months ago, the research team involved in that project were in a meeting with some engineers, some risk experts, their funders, and also people like Brian Wynne, who might be familiar to the academic section of you, as a person that's looked at these questions of science governance for a long time. And as well as just asking them about questions that, if you like, a university ethics committee would have to deal with, such as, is it safe, is it ethical, are people going to get annoyed by launching a balloon into the sky and squirting water out of it, they were also asked some rather difficult questions about, well, how is this project framed? Is it just seen as a one-off experiment, or is it framed as part of a trajectory towards a future that is in some way geoengineered? They were asked to, and these are just engineers, so you know this is quite a difficult thing for them to do because they've had no expertise or experience in doing so. They were asked to imagine the downstream implications and applications and try and feed those back into the early stages of the research project. And they were asked about the extent to which they had already listened to or sought the public and stakeholder views and their plans for doing so in the future, and were only allowed to proceed subject to all of these points being addressed. So this is an interesting new model of governance that I would argue takes on some of the lessons of upstream engagement and actually puts them into place in a new sort of mechanism. Now, I would just leave you with that as one possible approach forward, but also I think one of the things that we might want to discuss after the break is, well, who's that going to piss off? Because that seems like quite a difficult set of questions for many scientists to have to answer. Are we in the future going to expect all of our scientists to have to go through this process, or is the fact that one group have gone through this process, does that make it unnecessary in the future? So I'll leave it there, hand over to Jamie, and then we can pick it up.